The courthouse steps in Clearwater, Kansas, blazed under the August sun of 1872. But the heat wasn't what made decent folks look away. Sarah Beth Whitman stood on that makeshift auction platform holding 6-month-old Mary against her chest, both dressed in their Sunday best, despite what was fixing to happen. The auctioneer's voice rang out cold as winter. Lot 17, widow, woman, and child. Payment for outstanding debts. Bidding starts at $20. The crowd below laughed cruel and low. Henrik Kraus, the saloon owner with hands that wandered where they shouldn't, called out his bid with a leer that made Sarah Beth's skin crawl. "Buying myself some damaged goods today," he said, and the men around him chuckled like it was the finest joke they'd heard. Baby Mary started crying then, the sound cutting through all that ugly laughter. Sarah Beth whispered soft and steady, "Hush now, baby girl. Mama won't let anything bad happen to you." Going once, going twice. The auctioneer's hammer hung in the blazing air. That's when they heard it, hoofbeats, steady and sure, coming through the dust. The stranger who rode into Clearwater that day didn't look like much. Caleb Morrison sat his bay horse quiet and easy, taking in the scene with eyes that had seen too much of this world's ugliness. 45 years old, weathered by sun and hardship, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing when to speak and when to listen. The crowd turned to gawk at him, but Caleb's attention stayed fixed on the platform where that young widow stood holding her baby. He'd seen plenty of towns in his wandering years since the war, but this was the first time he'd seen decent folks auction off their neighbors like livestock. "Well, looky here," Mayor Hutchins called out from his spot near the courthouse door. The man wore his authority like a cheap suit, flashy but poorly fitted. "Looks like we got ourselves a newcomer just in time for the show." Doc Henderson stood off to the side, fidgeting with his medical bag like it might hold the cure for what ailed this whole sorry situation. The old physician had delivered that baby up on the platform, had tended the widow when her husband died in that farming accident 6 months back. Now he couldn't even meet her eyes. From the crowd came whispers, the kind that spread like prairie fire. That's the one who told Mayor Hutchins no when he came calling. Proud as Lucifer, that woman. Debts got to be paid somehow. But Caleb had been around long enough to smell the stench of something rotten beneath the surface. He'd seen corrupt officials before, men who twisted the law to serve their own appetites. The way Hutchins stood there with that satisfied smirk, like a cat with cream on its whiskers, that told the real story. Mrs. Abernathy from the general store wrung her hands, tears threatening to spill. She knew Sarah Beth from church, knew her as the finest schoolteacher 3 counties had ever seen. But knowing right from wrong and having the backbone to act on it, those were 2 different things entirely. Caleb dismounted slow and deliberate, his spurs ringing against the wooden steps. The crowd fell quiet, sensing something different about this stranger. He moved like a man who'd made hard choices before and would make them again. "What's the bidding at?" he asked, his voice carrying clear across the square. $40, Henrik Kraus snarled. "But this ain't your concern, stranger. Move along." Caleb looked up at Sarah Beth, then really looked at her. Beneath the fear and humiliation, he saw something that reminded him of steel wrapped in silk. She stood straight, despite everything, protecting her child with a fierce love that made his chest tighten with memory. "I'll take responsibility for them both," he said, the words coming out steady and sure. Mayor Hutchins's face darkened like a storm cloud, and Caleb knew right then that his guess had been dead on target. This whole ugly business was about more than debts. It was about a powerful man who didn't like hearing the word no. Caleb reached into his vest and pulled out everything he had, $47 in worn bills and his father's silver watch. The timepiece caught the sunlight, showing intricate engravings that spoke of better days and family pride. It was the last thing connecting him to the man he'd been before the war changed everything. "This ought to cover it," he said, placing the money and watch on the platform. The crowd murmured, realizing this stranger wasn't some rich cattle baron looking to buy himself a servant. He was giving up everything he owned for two people he'd never met. Henrik Kraus spat in the dust, his ugly intentions thwarted by a man with deeper pockets and cleaner conscience. Sarah Beth stared at Caleb with wide eyes, unable to believe what she was seeing. Men who helped without expecting something in return were rarer than hen's teeth in her experience. "Ma'am," Caleb said, his voice gentle as morning rain, "you're free to go wherever you please. This here was just settling accounts, far as I see it." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Baby Mary had quieted in the stranger's presence, some instinct telling her this was a safe harbor in dangerous waters. Caleb shrugged out of his dusty coat and placed it around Sarah Beth's shoulders, shielding her from the crowd's stares. The simple gesture was more intimate than any touch, showing respect where she'd been given nothing but shame. As they walked through the hostile crowd, Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward on unsteady legs. "Wait!" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled a soft blanket from her store and a small jar of preserved peaches. "For the baby," she said, not meeting anyone's eyes. It was the first crack in the town's hard heart, small but significant. Doc Henderson nodded slightly in approval, recognizing the courage it took for Abernathy to show kindness when the crowd wanted blood. They made it to the edge of town before Mayor Hutchins caught up, his deputy trailing behind like a loyal hound. "This ain't over, stranger," he said, his voice low and threatening. "That woman owes this town, and debt's got to be paid proper." Caleb turned slow, and something in his eyes made the deputy take a step back. "Seems to me the debt's been settled fair and square. Unless there's something else eating at you, Mayor." Hutchins' face flushed red, but he couldn't say what was really gnawing at his gut, that Sarah Beth Whitman had turned down his advances and made him feel small. Instead, he settled for threats. "You'd best keep moving, mister. This town don't take kindly to troublemakers." "Neither do I," Caleb replied, and there was iron in his voice that spoke of cavalry charges and Confederate bullets. "Neither do I." As the mayor and his deputy rode back to town, Sarah Beth found her voice at last. "Why?" she asked simply. Caleb adjusted his hat against the setting sun. "Some things a man can't walk away from, ma'am. This was one of them." That first evening, Caleb set up camp in a sheltered grove just outside town, making sure to place his bedroll a respectful distance from where Sarah Beth would sleep. He moved with quiet efficiency, building a small fire and arranging stones for a proper cooking area. Everything about his actions spoke of a man who understood how to make a woman feel safe without making her feel trapped. Baby Mary had developed a fever during the heat of the day, and Sarah Beth rocked her gently by the firelight, worry etched in every line of her face. Without being asked, Caleb fetched fresh water from the creek, testing it with his finger to make sure it was cool enough for the child. "Here," he said, offering a clean cloth. "Sometimes a cool compress helps bring the fever down." His hands were gentle as he helped adjust the damp cloth on Mary's forehead, and Sarah Beth found herself studying this stranger who'd turned her world upside down. There was something about the way he moved, careful but confident, that spoke of experience with children. "You know about babies," she observed. "Some," he said, not elaborating, but his eyes grew distant, looking at something far beyond the firelight. As the fever broke and Mary settled into peaceful sleep, Sarah Beth felt something loosen in her chest, the first real breath she'd taken since her husband died. "I was a school teacher," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Before I married Thomas. Before—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing all the loss and heartbreak. "Good profession," Caleb said. "Takes patience and wisdom both. What about you? What brings a man to Kansas with nothing but the clothes on his back?" "Cavalry," he said simply. "Did my service, saw the elephant. Now I work ranches, mostly. Go where the work takes me." There was more to the story. Sarah Beth could hear it in the careful way he chose his words, but she didn't press. They were both carrying wounds that needed gentle handling. Later, as the fire burned low, Caleb pulled out his pocket knife and began whittling a piece of fallen branch. His hands worked sure and steady, shaving away thin curls of wood until the shape of a small horse began to emerge. "For Mary," he said, holding up the half-finished toy. "Every child ought to have something made just for her." The simple kindness of it, a grown man taking time to carve a toy for a baby who wasn't his, brought tears to Sarah Beth's eyes. When had anyone last thought about Mary's happiness instead of just her survival? As full dark settled around them, Sarah Beth pulled out her worn Bible and read scripture by candlelight, her voice soft and musical. Caleb listened without comment, but she could tell he was truly hearing the words, not just enduring them. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The ancient words seemed to wrap around their small camp like a blessing, and for the first time since Thomas died, Sarah Beth felt something like peace settling into her bones. That's when they heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats, steady and purposeful. 3 riders by the sound, and they were heading straight for the grove. Torches flickered through the trees, and the jingle of spurs cut through the night air like a warning. Mayor Hutchins rode into their camp like he owned the territory, flanked by his deputy and the town's part-time constable. The torchlight made harsh shadows on his face as he dismounted, all bluster and false authority. "Evening, folks," he said, but there wasn't anything friendly in his tone. "Got some legal concerns need addressing." Caleb stood slowly, his hand resting easy near his sidearm. He'd faced down Confederate cavalry and Kansas bushwhackers. 3 small-town bullies didn't particularly worry him. "What kind of concerns would those be, Mayor?" "The kind that involve harboring stolen property," Hutchins said, his eyes fixed on Sarah Beth. "That woman there ain't paid her debts to this community. Makes her a thief in the eyes of the law." "I paid her debts," Caleb said calmly. "Public auction, fair and square. Even got witnesses." Hutchins' face darkened. "There's more debts than just money, stranger. Debts of obligation. Debts of respect." That's when Sarah Beth found her voice, rising to her feet, with baby Mary clutched tight against her chest. The firelight caught the steel in her eyes as she looked straight at the mayor. "Tell him the truth, Mayor Hutchins," she said, her voice carrying clear through the night air. "Tell him about your midnight visits after Thomas died. Tell him about the proposition you made and what happened when I said no." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a blade. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly in the darkness. "You're mistaken, woman," Hutchins said, but his voice had gone tight and careful. "Grief can muddle a person's thinking, make them imagine things that ain't so." "Like fabricated debts?" Sarah Beth pressed. Like claiming my husband owed money to the town when the only debt was $3 to Henderson's store. Like putting a school teacher and her baby on an auction block because she wouldn't let you into her bed? Caleb's eyes never left the mayor, but he could feel the truth of it settling into his bones like cold. This wasn't about money at all. It was about a powerful man's wounded pride and twisted desires. Young Tommy Corrigan, the half-wild orphan boy who lived rough around the edges of town, had followed the men from a distance. Hidden in the shadows beyond the firelight, he heard every word. Truth was like water. It found its own level and flowed where it would. By morning, half the town would know what really happened on that auction platform. "That's quite an accusation, ma'am," Deputy Rawlings said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd heard the talk, seen how the mayor looked at pretty widows and young girls. Most folks just looked the other way because it was easier than standing up to power. "It's quite a truth," Sarah Beth replied, and there was no backing down in her voice. She'd been pushed as far as a woman could be pushed, and she'd found her fighting ground at last. Mayor Hutchins remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. The torchlight made his face look demonic as he leaned down toward Caleb. "You've got till dawn to reconsider, stranger. Then we settle this proper, according to law and custom. Some things can't be bought with silver and sentiment." As the three riders disappeared back toward town, Caleb checked his revolver and rifle, making sure both were clean and ready. He'd hoped this would be simpler, but simple and right didn't always travel the same trail. "I'm sorry," Sarah Beth said quietly. "I didn't mean to drag you into my troubles." "Ma'am," Caleb said, settling back down by the dying fire, "some troubles are worth dragging into. This is one of them." But as he stared into the darkness where the mayor's men had vanished, he couldn't shake the feeling that dawn would bring more than just sunrise. By mid-morning, Clearwater had split right down the middle like a log under a sharp axe. Tommy Corrigan had done his work well, spreading the truth about Mayor Hutchins' real motives through the town faster than news of a gold strike. Some folks shook their heads in shame, finally understanding what they'd really witnessed on those courthouse steps. Others circled the wagons around their mayor, more afraid of change than they were of truth. Caleb discovered just how divided things had gotten when he rode into town for supplies. The general store fell silent when he walked in, and Mrs. Abernathy served him with nervous hands while her husband glowered from behind the counter. "You're stirring up trouble," Abernathy said, his voice tight with worry. "Some things are better left alone." "Some things fester if you don't clean them out proper," Caleb replied, counting out coins for coffee and hardtack. At the hotel, the desk clerk wouldn't even look at him. "No rooms available," the man said, though the guest book lay open and empty. On the street, men stepped aside when he passed, some with shame, others with barely concealed hostility. But it wasn't all cold shoulders. Doc Henderson caught up with Caleb as he was leaving the apothecary, a small bundle tucked under his arm. "For the baby," the doc said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't observed. "Fever medicine and some salve for teething. No charge." It was a small act of courage, but courage nonetheless. The old physician was finally finding his backbone, even if it meant risking the mayor's displeasure. When Caleb returned to camp, he found Sarah Beth pacing like a caged wildcat, Mary fussing in her arms. The strain of the last 2 days was showing in the dark circles under her eyes and the tight set of her shoulders. "I should leave," she said without preamble. "Take Mary and catch the next train east. You've done enough, more than enough. I won't have your blood on my conscience." Caleb dismounted and took his time unsaddling his horse, choosing his words careful as a man picking his way through a minefield. "Where would you go?" "I have a sister in Missouri. She might take us in, at least until I can find work. Might? Sarah Beth's face crumpled slightly. We haven't spoken since I married Thomas. She thought I was making a mistake, marrying a farmer and moving to Kansas. She might not even open the door. So you'd run to maybe instead of standing for certain? Her eyes flashed with anger. I'm not running. I'm being practical. This isn't your fight. Caleb sat down on a fallen log and gestured for her to join him. When she reluctantly settled beside him, he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who'd faced his share of hard choices. Ma'am, I've walked away from things before, times when it seemed smarter to keep moving than to plant my feet and make a stand. But some things, he paused, looking out at the Kansas prairie stretched endless under the big sky. Some things a man can't walk away from and still look himself in the mirror. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. Why does my fight matter to you? For a long moment, the only sounds were Mary's contented babbling and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. I had a wife once, a little boy too, about Mary's age. Cholera took them while I was away on patrol. Came home to fresh graves and nothing but regret. He turned to look at Sarah Beth, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I failed them when they needed me most. I won't fail you and Mary, not if I can help it. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky red as blood, Sarah Beth mended Caleb's torn shirt by firelight. The bullet hole in the shoulder had been patched before, she could tell, but her neat stitches made it almost like new. It was a small intimacy, the kind shared by people who were becoming family without quite realizing when it happened. You don't have to do that, Caleb said, watching her work. Yes, I do, she replied, not looking up from her sewing. A man who carves toys for babies and stands up to bullies deserves to have his clothes mended proper. It was nearly midnight when the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful silence. This time it wasn't Mayor Hutchins coming calling, it was his deputy riding hard and fast. Federal marshals, Deputy Rawlings called out as he pulled up short of their camp. 3 of them, riding in from Dodge City. Should be here by morning. Caleb stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. What's their business in Clearwater? Mayor says they're coming to arrest you for kidnapping and theft. Says he sent word that you stole town property and fled with stolen goods. But there was something in the deputy's voice, a doubt that hadn't been there before. Maybe Tommy's words were working on more hearts than just the townspeople's. That what you think, deputy? Rawlings shifted in his saddle, his conscience warring with his loyalty. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes the law and what's right ain't exactly the same thing. As the deputy rode back toward town, Sarah Beth clutched Mary closer to her chest. Federal marshals, she whispered. He's calling in federal marshals. But Caleb was staring off toward the eastern horizon, where morning would bring more than just sunshine. His face was grim but determined. Then I reckon, he said quietly, we'll see what kind of law they're bringing with them. The federal marshal who rode into Clearwater with the dawn looked nothing like what Mayor Hutchins had expected. Marshal Tom Johnson was a lean man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of frontier justice to know the difference between law and lawlessness. He wore his badge with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned it through years of walking dangerous ground. The confrontation came to a head in the town square, with half of Clearwater gathered to watch. Hutchins stood on the courthouse steps, like a politician giving a speech, gesturing dramatically as he laid out his case. Marshal Johnson, he declared, his voice carrying across the square. "That man there kidnapped our town's property, a woman and child who were being sold to settle legal debts. He's a thief, and probably worse." But Marshal Johnson had been asking questions since he'd arrived, talking to folks quietly and separately. He'd heard Doc Henderson's careful words about fabricated debts, seen Mrs. Abernathy's tearful confession about the real reason behind the auction. Most importantly, he'd listened to young Tommy Corrigan tell the truth, with the clear voice of someone too young to understand the value of convenient lies. "Is that so?" Johnson said, his voice carrying the dry tone of a man who'd heard every kind of tall tale the frontier could produce. "Well now, Mayor, I've got to say, your story's got more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese." He pulled out a well-worn notebook and read from it carefully. According to the county records, one Thomas Whitman died owing exactly $3.47 to Henderson's store. That debt was paid by his widow 2 weeks after the funeral. No other debts on record. Hutchins' face went red as a sunset. There were other obligations. What kind of obligations? Johnson's voice cut through the mayor's bluster like a blade through butter. The kind that come from a widow refusing your advances. The kind that make a man abuse his office to get what he can't get through charm. The crowd murmured, sensing the shift in the wind. Some of the men who'd been supporting Hutchins began to look uncomfortable, remembering their own wives and daughters. Sarah Beth stood beside Caleb, her chin high despite everything. When the marshal's gaze fell on her, she spoke clear and strong. "Marshal, I'm Sarah Beth Whitman. I was married to Thomas Whitman for 6 years and taught school in this county for 3 years before that. I never owed this town anything but the $3 Dr. Henderson mentioned, and that was paid weeks ago." "And the real reason for the auction, ma'am?" Sarah Beth's voice didn't waver. "Mayor Hutchins came to my house 3 times after my husband's funeral, making propositions that no decent man makes to a grieving widow. When I refused him, he fabricated debts and had me put on that auction block." Marshal Johnson nodded slowly, then turned his attention to Caleb. "And you, sir, what's your part in all this?" "Name's Caleb Morrison, Marshal. I saw what was happening and couldn't stomach it. Paid the woman's supposed debts and set her free. That's all there is to it." "That all?" Johnson's eyes were sharp, reading something deeper in Caleb's face. This was the moment Caleb had been dreading, when the past he'd been carrying would have to come to light. He glanced at Sarah Beth, saw the trust in her eyes, and made his choice. "No, Marshal, that ain't all." His voice was quiet but steady. "I lost my own wife and son to cholera while I was away on cavalry duty. Came home to find them dead and buried while I was chasing Confederate raiders across Missouri. I failed them when they needed me most." The words hung in the morning air like a prayer, raw with old grief and fresh honesty. Sarah Beth's hand found his arm, offering silent comfort for wounds she was only now understanding. "I saw that woman and her baby on that platform," Caleb continued, "and I knew I couldn't walk away. Maybe it won't bring back Emma and little Thomas, but it might make their deaths mean something if I can protect someone else's family." The revelation hit Sarah Beth like a physical blow. Everything made sense now. His gentle care with Mary, his fierce protectiveness, the way he'd sacrificed everything without expecting anything in return. He wasn't just saving them. He was trying to save himself from the guilt that had been eating him alive. Before she could speak, before she could offer the comfort he so desperately needed, young Tommy Corrigan came running across the square, his face bright with excitement. "Marshal! Marshal Johnson!" he called out. "You need to see what we found in the mayor's office, Mrs." Abernathy and Doc Henderson followed close behind, carrying a wooden strongbox between them. The doctor's face was grim as he set it down on the courthouse steps. "We found this hidden in his desk," Henderson said, "along with some papers that make for interesting reading." Marshal Johnson opened the box to reveal nearly $200 in various bills and coins, along with several official-looking documents. As he examined the papers, his expression grew darker. "Looks like Mayor Hutchins has been collecting taxes that were never approved by the county, charging fees for services that don't exist, and skimming money off legitimate town funds." Johnson looked up at the crowd, his voice carrying across the square. "This man's been robbing you all blind for the better part of 2 years." But the biggest surprise came when Henrik Kraus pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with anger. "I ain't going down for this alone," he snarled, pointing at the mayor. "You tell them about our arrangement, Hutchins, or I will." "Shut up, you fool," the mayor hissed, but it was too late. "He promised me first pick of any widow women that came up for auction," Kraus announced to the horrified crowd. "Said we could keep the town's undesirables in line if we worked together." The revelation sent a shock wave through the gathered townspeople. Several women gasped, and more than one man took a step toward the mayor with violence in his eyes. That's when Sarah Beth did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward and placed herself between the angry crowd and the corrupt officials, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Stop," she said, and something in her tone made everyone pause. "This isn't who we are. This isn't who we want to be." She turned to face the crowd, holding Mary close to her chest. "Yes, these men wronged me. Yes, they nearly destroyed my life and my daughter's future. But if we answer their hatred with more hatred, their violence with more violence, then we become no better than they are." Doc Henderson stepped forward, his voice filled with admiration. "What are you saying, Sarah Beth?" "I'm saying," she replied, looking around at her neighbors and friends, "that maybe it's time we started acting like the community we always claimed to be. Maybe it's time we built something better." She gestured toward the courthouse steps where the auction block had stood just days before. "What if, instead of seeking revenge, we used this as a chance to start over? What if we took the money they stole and used it to build something good?" The crowd fell silent, considering her words. Mrs. Abernathy was the first to speak. "What did you have in mind, dear?" Sarah Beth's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "A school," she said simply. "A real school, with proper books and supplies. A place where all the children in 3 counties can come to learn, regardless of their family's means." The murmur that went through the crowd was different now, hopeful instead of angry, constructive instead of destructive. Even Marshal Johnson nodded approvingly. "Now that," he said, "sounds like justice." But as the crowd began to disperse, planning for a better future, none of them noticed Henrik Kraus slipping away toward the saloon, his face dark with murderous intent. If he couldn't have what he wanted through the mayor's schemes, he'd take it by force. The sound of men gathering, of guns being loaded, and harsh whispers being exchanged drifted across the morning air like smoke from a dangerous fire. By noon, Henrik Kraus had gathered 8 men at his saloon, each one nursing a grievance against the changing order. They were the dregs of Clearwater, drifters, troublemakers, men who profited from other people's misery. The kind who'd rather tear down than build up, who saw kindness as weakness and justice as an inconvenience. "That woman made fools of us all," Kraus snarled, pouring whiskey with a heavy hand. "And that stranger who rides in here, acting like he owns the place. It's time they learned what happens to folks who don't know their place." The men around him muttered agreement, their faces flushed with liquor and wounded pride. They'd been looking forward to Sarah Beth's humiliation, had been planning what they'd do to her once she was broken and defenseless. Now she was being treated like some kind of hero, and they couldn't stomach it. "What about the federal marshal?" asked Pete Kowalski, a drifter with a lazy eye and a quick temper. "What about him?" Krause's smile was ugly as sin. "He'll be riding out soon enough, and when he does, we'll settle things our way." The way they should have been settled from the start. Word of the gathering reached Caleb through the town's unofficial network of decent folks. Doc Henderson brought the news, his face grave with worry. "They're armed and drinking," he reported quietly. "Talking about teaching you and Sarah Beth a lesson. Marshal Johnson's planning to leave this afternoon. Says his work here is done." Caleb stood at the edge of their camp, watching the sun climb toward its peak. He could feel the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Run or stay, fight or flee. It was a choice he'd faced before, in war and peace, and the answer never got easier. "We should go," Sarah Beth said, reading his thoughts. "Take Mary and head east while we can. There's been enough violence already." But even as she spoke the words, her voice lacked conviction. She'd found something in Clearwater she hadn't expected. The possibility of belonging, of being valued for who she truly was. The thought of the school, of teaching children again, of building something lasting and good, it pulled at her heart like a physical ache. "Running's the smart play," Caleb agreed, but he made no move toward his horse. Probably the right play, too. They stood in silence, watching Mary play with her wooden horse in the dappled shade. The little girl had no idea how precarious her world was, how much depended on the choices the adults around her would make in the next few hours. That's when they heard it. Horses approaching fast, too many of them for any peaceful purpose. Caleb's hand moved to his gun as 8 armed men rode into their camp, spread out in a rough semicircle like wolves surrounding prey. Henrik Krause sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a revolver in the other. His eyes were bright with drink and malice as he looked down at the small family. "Well now," he said, his words slightly slurred, but his intent crystal clear. "Oh, looks like it's time for some proper justice." Caleb stepped in front of Sarah Beth and Mary, his stance easy but ready. He'd faced down cavalry charges and prairie storms. 8 drunk bullies didn't particularly frighten him, but he was only one man, and there were innocents to protect. "You boys are making a mistake," he said calmly. "Marshal Johnson's still in town. He hears gunfire. He'll come running." "Marshall's busy packing his bags," laughed Pete Kowalski. "Besides, way we figure it, you attacked us first. Self-defense, you might say." But before anyone could make a move, something unexpected happened. Doc Henderson appeared at the edge of the camp, his medical bag in one hand and an old cavalry saber in the other. His face was pale, but determined as he took his place beside Caleb. "Gentlemen," he said in his careful, professional voice, "I believe you're trespassing on private property, Mrs." Abernathy was next, emerging from the other side of the grove with her husband's shotgun held steady in her hands. Her voice shook slightly, but her aim was true. "Henrik Krause, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." One by one they came, the decent folks of Clearwater who'd finally found their courage. The blacksmith with his heavy hammer, the schoolmarm with her husband's pistol, even old Judge Morrison with a rifle that had seen service in the Mexican War. They formed a protective circle around Caleb's small family, their faces showing the same determination that had built the frontier in the first place. "Looks like you're outnumbered," Caleb observed mildly. But Henrik Krause wasn't done yet. Desperation and whiskey made for a dangerous combination, and he raised his revolver with the weaving precision of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "Stand aside, old man," he snarled at Doc Henderson, "or we'll move you permanent-like." That's when Sarah Beth did the bravest thing of her life. She stepped out from behind Caleb, baby Mary still in her arms, and faced down the armed men with nothing but her voice and her unshakable dignity. "No," she said simply, "I won't let you turn my daughter's future into something built on violence and hatred. If you want to destroy what we're trying to build here, you'll have to go through me first." Mary chose that moment to babble happily, reaching out toward the horses with the fearless curiosity of innocence. The sound cut through all that tension like a church bell on Sunday morning, reminding every man present what they were really fighting about. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. 8 guns against a dozen defenders with a baby caught in the middle. Then Henrik Krause's finger tightened on the trigger, and time seemed to slow like honey in winter. "Step aside, old man, or we'll move you." The standoff stretched tight as a fiddle string, with death hanging in the balance and innocent lives at stake. Henrik Krause's revolver wavered between targets, while his men shifted nervously in their saddles, suddenly realizing they were facing their own neighbors instead of helpless victims. That's when Marshal Johnson's voice cut through the tension like thunder across the prairie. "I'd think real careful about what you do next, boys." He sat his horse at the edge of the grove, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight and his own weapon drawn, but pointed skyward. Beside him rode 2 men nobody expected to see, Sheriff Coleman from the county seat and a federal prosecutor from Topeka. "Thought you'd left town," Krause snarled, but his gun hand was shaking now. "Changed my mind," Johnson replied calmly. "See, I got to thinking about corruption and how deep it might run. Decided to do a little more investigating before I moved on." The prosecutor, a thin man in a good suit and wire spectacles, pulled out an official-looking document. "Henrik Krause, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Kansas, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted assault, and violation of federal civil rights statutes." "What the hell are you talking about?" Krause's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Turns out," Johnson explained to the crowd, "Mayor Hutchins wasn't the only one keeping records. Found a whole ledger in your saloon safe, Henrik. Real interesting reading about forced labor contracts, debt manipulation, and plans to acquire merchandise through legal channels." Sarah Beth felt her knees go weak as the full scope of what she'd escaped became clear. This hadn't been just about one corrupt mayor's wounded pride. It had been about something much darker and more systematic. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As Krause's men began laying down their weapons in the face of federal authority, Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "There's something else," she said, her voice breaking. "Something we should have done months ago." She reached into her apron and pulled out a worn cloth bag, heavy with coins. "This is from all of us. Everyone who stood by and watched that auction happen. Everyone who knew it was wrong but didn't have the courage to speak up." Doc Henderson nodded, his own eyes bright with emotion. "We took up a collection, Sarah Beth. Not just to pay back what was stolen from you, but to build that school you talked about, to make something good come out of all this ugliness." One by one, the townspeople stepped forward with their contributions. The blacksmith, shamefaced but determined. The general store owner, his wife, nodding encouragement. Even Judge Morrison, who'd watched the auction from his office window and done nothing to stop it. "We can't undo what happened," Mrs. Abernathy said through her tears. "But we can make sure it never happens again. We can build something better." The final twist came when young Tommy Corrigan rode up on a borrowed horse, his face bright with excitement and official papers clutched in his dirty hand. "Miss Sarah Beth," he called out, "the county commissioner wants to talk to you about being the official school teacher for 3 districts. Says the territory needs educated folks who understand what real community looks like." Sarah Beth stared at the papers, hardly daring to believe what she was reading. Not just a job, but a calling. Not just survival, but a chance to build something lasting and meaningful. As Henrik Krause and his men were led away in chains, and the corrupt mayor faced his own federal charges, something else happened that nobody quite expected. Baby Mary, who'd been quiet through all the excitement, suddenly reached out her chubby arms toward Caleb with a sound that was unmistakably "Pa-pa." The silence that followed was different from before, not tense or fearful, but full of wonder and possibility. Sarah Beth looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw not just the man who'd saved them, but the man who'd chosen them, who'd carved toys and mended fences and stood ready to die for a family that wasn't even his by blood. "Caleb," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her eyes, and everything he'd been afraid to hope for was right there in her gaze. Love earned through sacrifice, trust built through shared hardship, and the promise of a future that neither of them had dared imagine just days before. "Ma'am," he said, his own voice rough with emotion, "if you'll have me, I'd be honored to help you build that school, build that life, build that family we never thought we'd get to have." The townspeople erupted in cheers and applause, but Sarah Beth and Caleb only had eyes for each other and the baby girl who'd just claimed them both as her own. Marshal Johnson tipped his hat and rode away with a satisfied smile, leaving behind a community that had finally learned the difference between law and justice, between power and strength. As the sun began to set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of hope and redemption, 3 people who'd been strangers just days before walked toward town together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as a family bound by choice and sealed by love. 3 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across Clearwater like the sweetest music the town had ever heard. Sarah Beth stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse, watching her students practice their letters on slate boards, while baby Mary napped peacefully in her cradle nearby. The school had risen from the ashes of corruption like something out of a fairy tale, built with recovered stolen funds and community labor. Every man who'd stood silent during the auction had contributed sweat and skill to the construction, working side by side to create something beautiful out of their shared shame and newfound determination. Caleb had been hired as the town's new sheriff after Marshal Johnson recommended him for the position. It was fitting work for a man who understood the difference between keeping the peace and keeping people down. His badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a promise that never again would the powerful prey upon the powerless in Clearwater. The courthouse steps had been scrubbed clean and rebuilt, with a brass plaque that read simply, "Justice is not for sale." Where the auction block had stood, a school bell now rang out each morning, calling children to learning instead of calling people to witness cruelty. Doc Henderson had found his backbone and kept it, becoming not just the town physician, but its moral compass. Mrs. Abernathy had been elected to the new town council, her voice now raised in protection instead of whispered in fear. Even young Tommy Corrigan had found his place, working as Sarah Beth's teaching assistant and proving that truth-telling was its own kind of heroism. But the real transformation was in the daily moments, the small kindnesses that had become as natural as breathing. Neighbors helping neighbors, children playing together regardless of their family's means, and a community that had learned to stand up for what was right instead of sitting down for what was easy. On this particular afternoon, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb finished his rounds and headed home to the small house they'd built behind the school. Home. The word still felt strange in his mouth after so many years of wandering, but it tasted sweeter than honey from the comb. He found Sarah Beth in their kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. Mary sat in her high chair, babbling happily while she played with the wooden horse that had become her most treasured possession. When she saw Caleb, her face lit up like Christmas morning. "Papa!" she squealed, reaching out with eager arms. The word still hit him like a physical blow, but a good one, the kind that knocked the breath out of you with pure joy. He scooped her up and spun her around, her delighted giggles filling the room with music. "How was school today?" he asked Sarah Beth, settling Mary on his knee while his wife, continued cooking. "Wonderful," she replied, her smile warm as summer sunshine. Little Jenny Morrison read her first complete sentence, and the Kowalski boys didn't fight once during arithmetic. "I think we're making real progress." They'd been married for 6 weeks now, a quiet ceremony performed by the circuit preacher with the whole town in attendance. It wasn't a marriage born of desperation or convenience, but of genuine love that had grown from shared values and mutual respect, the kind of love that could weather any storm because it was built on solid ground. That evening, after Mary was tucked into her crib and the dinner dishes were washed and put away, Caleb and Sarah Beth sat on their front porch, watching the sun set over the endless Kansas prairie. She leaned against his shoulder while he whittled another toy, a wooden doll this time, for when Mary got older. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't ridden into town that day?" Sarah Beth asked quietly. Caleb considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "Reckon you and Mary would have found your way somehow." "Strong women usually do." "That's not what I meant." He understood, of course. She was asking about the man he'd been before, the guilt-ridden drifter who'd been running from his own failures for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. The man who'd believed his dead family would never forgive him for not being there when they needed him most. "I think," he said slowly, "that Emma and little Thomas would be proud of what we built here, proud that their deaths weren't the end of the story, but the beginning of something good." Sarah Beth tilted her head to look at him, seeing the peace that had settled into the lines around his eyes. "You don't carry that guilt anymore, do you?" "Still carry it," he admitted, "but it doesn't weigh me down the same way. Feels more like responsibility now. To honor their memory by protecting the family I've got instead of mourning the family I lost." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over their little corner of the world. In the distance, they could hear the night sounds of a healthy community, dogs barking, children being called in for baths, the gentle murmur of neighbors visiting over back fences. "Caleb?" Sarah Beth's voice was soft as a prayer. "Thank you for riding into town that day, for seeing us as worth saving, for choosing us when you could have chosen to keep moving." He set down his whittling and pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair and the promise of all their tomorrows. "Thank you," he replied, "for letting me stay, for seeing something worth saving in a broken-down cavalryman with too much guilt and too few answers." Inside the house, Mary stirred in her sleep and made the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming. Safe sounds, happy sounds, the sounds of a child who'd never doubt that she was loved and protected. As the stars came out over Clearwater, Kansas, 3 people who'd been strangers just months before settled into the quiet rhythm of a family that had been forged in crisis and tempered in love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build something better, new chances to prove that justice and mercy could walk hand in hand. But tonight, there was just this: the sweet satisfaction of a job well done, a community healed, and a love that had grown from the ashes of loss into something beautiful and eternal. Now, friends, you might be wondering what happened to that little family as the years rolled on. Well, I'm happy to tell you that Sarah Beth's school became the finest in 3 counties, sending more young folks to college than any institution had a right to expect from a frontier town. Mary grew up smart as a whip and twice as spirited, eventually becoming a teacher herself and carrying on her mama's work. Caleb served as sheriff for 15 years, and not once in all that time did anyone get auctioned off on those courthouse steps. He had a way of settling disputes before they turned ugly, and most folks said it was because he understood what it felt like to be powerless and was determined that nobody else would face that feeling alone. But here's the thing that strikes me most about this old story. It took just one person willing to say, "This ain't right," to wake up a whole community's conscience. One man who could have kept writing, but chose instead to plant his feet and make a stand. One woman who could have stayed silent, but found the courage to speak truth to power. You see, that auction platform wasn't just selling Sarah Beth and her baby that day. The whole town was selling its soul, one compromise at a time, one turned back at a time, one "it ain't my business" at a time. They'd forgotten that a community isn't just a place where people live near each other. It's a place where people look out for each other. Sometimes it takes a stranger's eyes to show us what we've become, and a stranger's courage to remind us what we could be. Caleb Morrison wasn't a perfect man. He carried his share of regrets and failures like we all do. But he understood something that too many folks forget. Love isn't just a feeling you carry in your heart. It's a choice you make with your hands and your feet and your voice, especially when making that choice costs you something. Sarah Beth could have let bitterness poison her soul after what she suffered. Lord knows she had every right to hate the town that had treated her so poorly. Instead, she chose to plant seeds of forgiveness and watch them grow into something beautiful. That school of hers didn't just teach children their letters and numbers, it taught a whole community how to be better than their worst impulses. Every one of us has stood in that town square at some point in our lives, watching injustice happen and wondering if we've got the sand to speak up. Maybe it's not an auction platform, but it's something. A neighbor being picked on, a child being bullied, someone being treated unfair because they're different or powerless or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's what makes us human, not the times we walk away, but the times we find the courage to step forward, the times we choose to see the dignity in folks that others want to throw away, the times we remember that every person matters, especially the ones that society wants to forget. They say Caleb taught little Mary to say Papa before she could say Mama. And you know what? That sounds about right. Sometimes the best fathers aren't the ones who share your blood, but the ones who choose to share your burdens. Sometimes the strongest families aren't born, they're built, one act of courage at a time, one choice to stay instead of run, one decision to plant roots in hard ground and see what grows. The Clearwater of today is still there, still thriving, still home to descendants of folks who learned the hard way that a community is only as strong as its commitment to protecting the weakest among them. They've got problems like any place does, but they've never forgotten the lesson that auction platform taught them, that human dignity ain't for sale at any price. If this old story touched something in your heart, might be others need to hear it too. That's how good things spread in this world. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage inspiring the next. We're all connected in ways we don't always see, and sometimes the kindness we show a stranger comes back to us in ways we never could have imagined. Keep your hearts open, friends. You never know when you might be the one riding into someone else's story at just the right moment, with just the right words, carrying just the right kind of love to change everything. And remember, courage is contagious, hope is stronger than fear, and love remembered is love that lives on forever.